Hey, it's Adam from Judo Scale. Excited to be here with a guest lesson on GoRails. And today's topic is Flex. So Flex calls itself a framework for building fast, reusable, testable views in pure Ruby. To unpack that a bit, I would call it an ERB replacement. It's a way to write your views in Ruby instead of ERB. And I'd even go a step further and say it's a way to replace ERB and your helper methods with Ruby objects. And why would you want to do that? We'll get into that as we go through this. But for now, let's go ahead and dive into some code. Now, most of us aren't building greenfield apps. So in this lesson, we're actually going to refactor a real-world existing component in an existing application. And the component we're going to refactor is this modal component from the application that I work on every day called Judo Scale. And Flex works great with ERB, which makes it really nice to incrementally integrate it into your application. And so that's what we're going to do here. And as we look at the partial that renders this modal, you'll see we're basically just calling a bunch of helper methods to assemble the various parts of this modal component. And there's a lot of Ruby mixed in with this ERB, and this is an area where Flex is going to help us out a lot. The switching contexts between Ruby and HTML and ERB syntax can get messy, and it's one of the things that I really like about Flex. And also, all of the helper methods that we're calling here are global. They can be called from any partial or any view in our application. And likewise, if we dive into these helpers, we'll see that each of these helpers, they're also basically global methods that can be called from any other helper, any other view within our application. And what Flex is going to help us do is it's going to help us co-locate and encapsulate all of these things so that it's clear they're meant to be used together, and in fact, they can only be used together. So let's get started by installing Flex and replacing this in-modal helper with a Flex modal component. So we'll open our gem file, and in here we will add Flex Rails. Now Flex itself is not, whoops, got a typo there. Flex itself is not Rails specific. You can use Flex in any Ruby project. Flex Rails is a thin integration layer on top of Flex, and we'll see in a minute what that gives us. So I'm going to open my terminal and run bundle to install that. And once that gem installs, then we need to run a generator that's going to generate some files for us that we'll take a look at here in a second. So I'm going to go into the Flex Rails documentation and copy this generator line. And back in my terminal, I'll run that. This is going to generate a few new files, and it's going to make some changes to some existing files. I'm going to hop over to GitHub Desktop to take a look at those changes. And we can see that, let's take a look at the changes first. So it added some auto load paths to our application RB. This is just going to make it so that Rails picks up any new components we add or components that we change, so we don't have to manually require them or anything. We've got a similar change to our Tailwind config so that any class names that we have in our component files are automatically picked up by Tailwind. Then let's look at this application component file. So this is, Flex added this, and it's a subclass of Flex HTML. Flex HTML is the root class for any Flex view. So in fact, we don't have to use application component, but Flex Rails adds this just because it kind of fits other Rails conventions, and it gives us a single place to put any shared functionality of our components. Application view is then a subclass of application component, and the distinction between a view and a component within a Rails context for Flex is that a component is generally a part of a page, something that is probably going to be reused, whereas a view is where you're using Flex to render your entire view for a given action. But in fact, both of them are just subclasses of Flex HTML, which is the only requirement for a Flex view. We also have application layout here. If you wanted to write your application layout file in Flex, we're not actually going to use that in this lesson, but it's there and it's got an example template. It's got an example layout there if you want to use it. So let's jump back over to our code. And since Flex changed our application configuration, we need to restart our Rails server. Let's do that. Okay, I'll stop and restart my server. And now we can generate our modal component. So we're going to use another generator from the Flex documentation. We'll go to generators here and this one here to generate a new component. We're going to call our component modal. And let's take a look at what we have. So we've subclassed application component, which we just looked at a bit ago. And we have a template method, which is the one and only method that Flex requires in a Flex view. This is the method that gets run when you render a Flex component. And we've got some placeholder content in here, and we can already kind of see some of the Flex syntax. So for generating markup, HTML tags are methods, and Flex has a method for each HTML tag. And then you pass that method a block, which is the content of that tag. And likewise, you can pass keyword arguments to the method that'll then be attributes for that HTML tag. And we'll see that in a bit as well. But right now, let's just try to render this component to see if we can even see this placeholder content in there. If we hop over to where we were calling in modal, let's actually replace that with render. So we're just calling the same old render method that we would use if we were rendering a partial, but instead of a partial, we're going to render an instance of our component class. And now let's go refresh our page and see what that looks like. And the content's actually going to be all the way at the bottom because we're no longer in our modal wrapper that overlays the screen. And so here is that placeholder content that they put in there. So that's working as expected. And let's try to add some of our own content in there as well. If we just say, sure, hello world. And now if we refresh that, and we don't actually see that content. And the reason is because in Flex, content is only output if it is wrapped in one of these, in a Flex method. So right now, this string is just evaluated and then lost. It's not actually output anywhere. We need to actually put it in a Flex method. So we could put it in a paragraph tag or a div or anything like that. Or if we just wanted it to be just, plain text between these two elements, we can use the plain helper. And that is actually going to stick a piece of plain text in there, not wrapped in any kind of element at all. So that's just a little gotcha within Flex. You just got to make sure that anything you want to be output is actually, wrapped in one of Flex's methods. And Flex has a page in their documentation of helper methods that are really helpful for this kind of thing. So here's the plain that we just saw, and there's some other helpers for spitting out white space and comments and some other things. We won't go through all of them, but there's some good stuff there. So back at our component, the placeholder content's working, but what about all this stuff that we passed into the component through the block? Well, the block is passed into the template, but we're not actually yielding to that block at all. We're not calling that block. So let's get rid of this content here and just call yield and see if we can render that block. And we don't see the modal here, but if we scroll all the way down, we do see the content from that modal. And that's because, again, we've spit out that content, but we're still not wrapping it in that modal wrapper, which handles, placing it on the page in the right place. So instead of just yielding to this template, let's grab the implementation for this old method that we're not using anymore. Let's actually grab these options too. So now when we render our template, we're gonna use content to put this content in the right place on the page. We're gonna render our modal wrapper, and we're gonna pass the block along to it. Let's see if that works. And here we're at another little gotcha within Flex. So any method that we call here needs to be defined within Flex. And it's because we could actually get to this helper through this helpers method within Flex that gives you access to all of your helpers. Let's actually see if that works. And is the content anywhere? It is not. So the reason this doesn't work is the built-in content for method doesn't handle appending the content to Flex's output buffer. So we need to use the Flex wrapper for this and any other helpers that we use. I'm actually gonna, well, let's just include it here for right now. I think this is it. I think it's just Flex helpers. Actually, it's probably Flex Rails helpers content for. Let's see if that works. So that works, and we're kind of back to where we started, right? We haven't changed any functionality. We're just kind of refactoring a helper method to a component. Now, I would recommend taking this include here and moving that up to application component, because we're probably going to end up wanting to add more helpers. Basically, any built-in helper that we use, we're going to need to include the Flex wrapper for, and it'll be convenient to have all those included within application component. But so far we haven't actually done anything useful. All we've done is move a method from one place to another. We moved this in-modal helper, which we don't need anymore, from a helpers module to a component template method. It hasn't really gained us anything. But now that we have this component, we can start getting some of the benefits of co-location and encapsulation. Because what we can do is we can take all of these helper methods from this modal helper, and we can move them in here. And in fact, we don't even need the modal prefix anymore, because these are all methods on a modal component. So it's obvious that it would be redundant to have that modal prefix. And now what we can do is we can go into our partial where we are rendering this component, and we can actually use the block that is automatically passed. So when you render a Flex component, if you give it a block, that block is going to be passed an instance of that component. And now we can call methods on that component. So instead of calling a global modal parts helper, we can call modal.parts, which is the parts method on the modal component that we just created. Likewise with modal header, modal content, and modal footer. I think that's all of them. Let's see if that works. Okay, we're kind of hit by this helper issue again. Let's jump back there and look and see. Okay, yeah, so we're calling, right, so these helpers now, they were using a different type of content rendering that you need to do in helpers. They're calling the Rails tag helper, and they're using capture to capture a block and put it into the output stream. So now we can refactor these to use Flex syntax, which in Flex, we're just going to call div. The attributes are, we give the attributes to the div method, and then we can yield to the block. We can actually pass the block along to this tag to be the content. And we'll do the same thing for this, and the same thing for the footer. Let's see if that works. Okay, we're back to where we started. Everything looks correct. And the benefit now is that we have this encapsulation and co-location of these modal methods. They're no longer globally available. They're only available on this modal component. And it's very clear that they're only intended to be used within a modal component. So I think that's a big win. And we don't even need this modal helper file anymore. So I'm just going to get rid of that. And now let's see what it looks like to actually refactor an ERB partial into Flex code. So right now, this header method in our modal component, it just renders a partial. And we can actually bring that partial in here as Flex code. So if we look at modal header, so we could manually convert this to Flex, but there's actually a tool. I'm going to copy this, jump back over to the Flex documentation, and in this migrating to Flex section, there's a tool called Flexing, which converts ERB to Flex. Now I don't want it to automatically generate white space, and we don't need it to generate the Flex class. I just want to throw in the ERB. I'm going to copy this Flex code. And back in my modal component, so in this header method, instead of rendering modal header, let's see, it did a few weird things here. So the formatting's all messed up, but once I save it, my auto formatter will do that, but some of it is invalid right now. So the flexing tool didn't quite get this attribute right. This is using Alpine.js here, so that it's a bit non-standard HTML attribute syntax. Let's see, if I save this, will it format? Oh, it formatted for us. Excellent. A lot more readable now. We no longer need this render here. So it wrapped all of our strings in this percent parentheses quote syntax. I don't generally use that, but I'm not going to worry about it right now. Everything else looks good. I'm just going to add a little space in here. And let's see what this looks like if we bounce over to our application. Okay, we've got some more helpers that we need to include. So we need link to. And now, so SVG is an interesting one. We're actually calling SVG, it's a custom helper within our application, but Flex thinks we're calling the SVG element tag, one of its built-in methods. So we need to clarify that we're actually calling our own helper method. So right here, instead of just calling SVG, we want to call helpers.svg. And this will call our own SVG method that returns the markup for an SVG. Got to do it down here as well. Great, everything looks good. We no longer need this modal header file. I'm going to get rid of it. And so now this header method in here actually contains the markup for the header itself instead of calling out to what's essentially a global partial file. Now this is a personal preference thing. You might not like all of this markup, within this file. Obviously with a complex component, this could get pretty long if you're including all the markup for it. I personally like having all of it in one spot here instead of kind of spread out over multiple files that are essentially global. So one last improvement that I want to make before we wrap up here is back in this modal partial itself. When we first took a look at this, I mentioned that this is an ERB partial, but it's really mostly Ruby with a little bit of HTML mixed in, which gets kind of messy in ERB and I think is a lot cleaner in Ruby. So let's actually refactor this partial itself to a new component. So this is going to be this isn't going to be a generic modal component. This is going to be a specific modal component for what is the adapter setup within Judoscale. So I'm going to create a new component here. And actually, let's copy all of this content. copy this entire partial. Let's go back to that flexing tool. Copy this. Throw that into our template here. Let's see if it formats it for us. It does. Now, instead of rendering modal component here, I'm going to render adapter setup modal component. Whoops, I just called it adapter setup component. That's fine for now. I would probably want to rename it to adapter setup modal. That's fine. We don't need to pass it a block anymore. Let's see what happens here. And I misspelled it, so let's fix that. Okay, we're almost there. We've got the modal frame, but we don't have any content in it. Let's see what's going on. Okay, so I think part of the problem is that the flexing tool put all these plane helpers in here because the tool didn't know that these modal parts, modal header, these are all methods within that are doing flex things. So if modal parts was just a method in some Ruby object that returned a string, we would need plane to put it in the output stream. But modal parts is actually a method within a flex component, which is it's going to take care of getting content into the output stream. So we don't need these calls to plane. Styled button we might actually need. This is actually an internal helper method, which I'm actually surprised we didn't get an error for that. I'm actually just going to leave that in there for right now. I would expect that to raise an exception. Okay, now we're getting in there and getting some exceptions. I am surprised by this one because this is a route method, and I thought we had... Right, we are including, the Flex included this one by default so that we'd have access to our routes. Let's take a look at this error again. Yeah, this actually is not a valid route. It's because we're referencing instance variables in here. And Flex does not actually have access to our instance variables. Flex components only have access to the data that you explicitly provide to it. So yeah, we absolutely need to fix that. Let's go back. So we're referencing app and process type. So what we need to do is we need to pass these in. So when we're rendering our adapter setup component, let's pass app process. They are instance variables here because we're in ERB land. And then in our component, we're actually going to need an initializer. To set these instance variables for us. All right, let's see how we're doing then. Okay, form with, this is just a Rails helper that we need to bring in. Styled button. Okay, this is a custom helper, so we're going to delegate that to helpers. Let's see where we're at. Excellent. So now we're back to how we want things to look. And if we look at our code here, so within this component, we've got a flex component that's rendering another flex component and passing a block to it. And like we said before, comparing this to the ERB partial, whoops, all right, let's just undo, see what it looked like before. Mostly Ruby code, a lot of percent brackets going on. Personally, I think it's a lot easier to read here. Yeah, I'm pretty happy with this refactor. So we ended up with two flex components. We've got our adapter setup component and our modal component. We've seen some of the benefits of co-location and encapsulation. We've seen some of the benefits of, partials that are a lot of Ruby. When you move them into a Ruby class, they become a lot more readable. A couple of other benefits that we haven't even touched on are the speed of Flex. They claim it's much faster than ERB. I haven't done any benchmarks myself, but it sounds like a nice benefit. And also the testability. Because our Flex components are so isolated and encapsulated, we can render them in isolation without having to go through our entire application stack, making testing our view logic a lot easier. So I hope this has been a helpful intro to Flex. It's something that I'm excited about. I hope some of you are excited about it as well. I'm glad I got to be here guesting on Go Rails, teaching this lesson, and I'll see you next time.